Hello and welcome to the Northern Saga Russian History Podcast. Today we'll be discussing the topic why the Soviet Union lost the space race.
Or not lost the space race, because that's debatable, but why they didn't put a man on the moon.
Alright.
We can have the whole lose the space race debate like at a later date, but right now we're just focusing on why they didn't put a man on the moon.
Alright, then I'm Alexander.
Yes, and I'm Philip.
And let's get started.
Yeah, sure. So, I guess, like always, before we start this, we're not professional historians by any stretch of the imagination. We're just doing this for fun. If you want to correct us in any way, then just, feel free to tell us. We don't take lightly to unconstructive criticism, however. So, please be nice. We don't want our feelings to get hurt.
And it's not our fault that the stuff we copied from Wikipedia is wrong, okay?
Yeah, that's crowdsourced and
Yeah.
not our fault at all.
Definitely.
So yeah, while the coronavirus is raging, why not discuss a bit of Soviet moon history, right?
Yeah.
So when we think of the space race, right, we think of it as this standoff between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? It's the culmination of this ideological struggle on who is best and who is worst, right?
Yes, and direct result of the technological advancements made in the Second World War.
Right. Again, that's another topic. I'd say that, Soviet space industry was already well in sway in the 30s. However, you could say it was accelerated to an extent by German scientists.
Sure.
But that's a whole nother topic. So when we think of the space race, like, especially here in the West, by the way, we're in Norway, so it's correct for me to say in the West. Okay, whatever. So here in the West, we almost always think as the pinnacle of the space race being the moon landings, right? Or more specifically, the manned moon landings, the manned ones by the United States, where Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and the other guy, they went to the moon and Neil Armstrong had this, one small step for man sort of speech, right?
No one remembers the other guy.
Yeah, poor him. Like, everyone remembers Buzz Aldrin, everyone remembers Neil Armstrong, but who was the other guy?
Yeah, we don't even know his name.
Yeah, I think it was because he wasn't actually on the moon. He was in the vehicle that orbited the moon, while the other two guys were, like, having fun and...
Well, and he was probably the most alone person in the entire world.
Yeah, I think about it, like, your friends are on the moon and they're, like, partying hard. They're like, the first humans on the moon, and you're just sitting there in your rocket just... Oh, I feel bad for him now. But anyway, we're getting carried away. So while the Americans did that, right, and people tend to forget the Soviet achievements in the space race, right? For example, a lot of people don't know the name of the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, or the name of the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, right? At least here, that is my experience with my generation, at least. But people still know Neil Armstrong, so this really speaks about, like, what we remember, right? And what people remember is the first time, humanity has stepped on an external celestial body, right? And this was, in no doubt, this was a huge victory, a huge political victory for the United States, right? Because it kind of, like, managed to set the bar for what the highest, like, achievement in space was. And so the question is why didn't the Soviets put a man on the moon? Because this, as it was for the Americans, this would have been also a very great political victory for them, right?
Right.
Yeah, and it was also a great way to show off the scientific advancements they made.
And if I recall, they had already sent craft to the moon.
Yeah. They've already put like lunar rovers and craft on the moon before the Americans did.
Right.
So, purely technically speaking, the Soviets were the first on the moon. Just the Americans were the first to film it, and not the first to film it even. Like, the Soviets were the first ones to take a picture of the moon. But whatever. Yeah, I think our biases are shining through here.
Yeah,
but,
just keep in mind that we're trying to be aware of our biases, but we definitely have some.
Considering we're both Russian, it's kind of hard. But excuse me. But yeah, but either way, it's really interesting to take a look at why the Soviets really didn't manage to put a man on the moon. And despite me being heavily biased towards Russia, and Soviet Russia in particular, here we can actually, I can at least admit some of the faults where the Soviets took, right? And like one of the, and really there are many factors that led to the Soviets not putting a man on the moon. It's a very multifaceted issue. It would be erroneous to just think that or say that there was only one factor that decided the entire outcome of the space race. However, there are some very key factors here that played a role in it. One of the most obvious ones is when we look at what actually makes putting a man on the moon possible, right? We think of moon rockets.
Yes.
Right? So, anyone who's like even slightly familiar with space exploration or the history of it knows that the American moon rocket was the Saturn V, right? It was this huge rocket with 5 very big rocket engines, right?
Right.
And
was that the one designed by Werner von Braun?
I think so, yes. I'm not really that big on American space history, but it's entirely possible. Werner von Braun was very involved in the space program.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the American one. And then we take a look at the Soviet proposal for a moon rocket, right? That was the N1, more specifically the N1L3. Now, the N1L3, it was a very peculiar rocket design. Anyone who has played Kerbal Space Program will feel very at home, like, looking at this rocket, because it was this huge rocket, which is something you need to get to the moon. However, instead of having 5 big rocket engines, like the Americans did, they instead opted to have 30 very small ones.
So, would you say there was a different design philosophy between the US and Soviet space or rocket design teams?
Definitely. I wouldn't say it wasn't really a design philosophy, it was more of a design necessity.
Right.
Yeah, because I think that given the chance, the Soviets would have definitely opted for having, a smaller amount of large engines than a huge amount of small engines, because, that's less variables to deal with and less that can go wrong. So, and really this design necessity I'm talking about, it really came forth due to many rivalries and disagreements within the Soviet space program, and just the organizational structure of the space program itself, which was, as in almost everything within the Soviet Union, overly complex and bureaucratic and inefficient.
Right.
Yeah. So, if we just take a look at the organizational structure, right? So the Soviet Union, right? They loved plans, right? They loved planning their economies, and they, by extent, also loved planning their industry.
So planning played an important role in every facet of the Soviet nation.
Right, exactly. Maybe not on the individual, but at least on the administrative and economic part of it. Yeah, and this was really prevalent in the way the Soviet space program was also organized. If we just take a look at how the Americans did it, right? They had a very straightforward approach. They had a separate government agency, NASA, right? That was responsible for all civilian, this is important, civilian space exploration, right?
Okay.
So, when we think of space, or any, like, area, like, at all, there's always this divide between civilian applications and military application, right? And the same thing applied here in the US, right? You had civilian space exploration, which was like, sending men into space and, showing forth their political victories. And you also had military space exploration.
And I assume that civilian space exploration was a lot easier to sell to the public than military one.
Yeah, and it was more public in general, as you can imagine.
Obviously.
Right. But either way, like, military space exploration, it pertains to everything like, reconnaissance satellites and, like Reagan with this...
Giant space lasers.
Yeah, exactly.
Star
Reagan.
Wars program.
Yeah, the Star Wars program, which is a whole other topic in of itself. But in the US, there was this clear separation, right, between military and civilian space affairs, right? The Soviets, they chose a different approach. They, instead of having a separate agency for civilian spaceflight, instead what they decided to do is that they already had an infrastructure for military space affairs, right?
Right.
And military industry. So what they did instead is that they meshed this civilian space effort into their entire military industry, right?
Which was linked directly to the Soviet economy.
Well, everything was linked directly
Yeah.
to the Soviet economy, but yeah, you could put it that way. So the point here is that the entire military industry, right? Now, I'm not talking only about space industry now. I mean the
tanks and rifles.
yeah,
and
tanks
soldiers.
and rifles and everything like that, and ships, right? They were also responsible for an ostensibly civilian space effort.
Yeah.
So what does this mean in practice? It means that the military has an enormous influence, right, on Soviet space exploration, on the space program.
Yeah,
Right.
although military influence in NASA would not be discounted. I mean, weren't most of the astronauts former soldiers or military personnel of different stripes?
Yeah, do you mean like the Russian cosmonauts or the?
I'm not thinking just in comparison to the American program.
Yeah, I mean the Americans. They also had a lot of like military pilots, right?
Yeah.
And like a lot of astronauts were military pilots, but that was because that was the best.
Similar skill set.
Yeah, it was a similar skill set, and it was like the best group to choose from.
Right.
Because they were already used to like high stress like situations and G forces and such, which is what you need when you put a man to a rocket. And but the point here is that here the political structure was really intertwined with the military, right?
Right.
So and what this meant in practice is that the only civilian space effort, or the only civilian space programs that were, I'm using the word civilian here quite like freely because there wasn't really a civilian space program in the Soviet Union, right?
Yes.
As we have, deduced. But anything that was related to space exploration, it had to be approved by the military. And here we see our first problem, right? With why the Soviets didn't put a man on the moon, is because the military, they weren't interested in it.
Right, because the civilian, should I say, part of the program had to sell their gold to the military leadership.
Exactly. If we take a look at the rocket that launched Sputnik 1, right? The first artificial satellite, it was called the R-7, and the R-7 was indeed the first ICBM of the USSR,
I
right?
see a trend there.
Yeah, so like you had all these civilian designers, right, who worked under the military,
Yes.
who had to sell their ideas to the military. And if you look at the N1, right, which was a giant rocket that didn't really have any practical application for the military, you can see why the military was reluctant in investing in it.
Right. So,
Yeah.
so this will be in contrast to Western space programs, namely NASA, where the civilian program would create an advancement or technology and then maybe the military could adopt it later. But here was directly the military controlling what advancements were made.
Yeah, of course the military answered to the party, right?
You're right.
So if the party said that we're launching a man to the moon, the military had to obey that, right?
So then that begs the question, did the party say we want a man on the moon?
Yes, they did. And but they did it because the Americans started on their manned lunar mission, right, in 1960, 1961, right? And the Soviets, a lot of the designers, right, that were working for these civilian agencies under the military, they also want to put a man on the moon, right? Because again, it would be a huge political victory.
Of course.
Yeah,
And really cool.
yeah, and really cool. We can't forget the cool factor here. But again, because of the political pressure from the military, they were kind of reluctant in investing it. However, the Soviets, they came to their senses in 1964, where upon a decree given by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, they issued an order to start production on a manned lunar mission. Right?
But then at this point, they're already behind the United States by 3 years.
Exactly. So, that's another factor, right? The timing. They came into the program way too late, and
It's not called a space race for nothing.
exactly. So they came into the moon race late, and as a result, a lot of other factors were originated from that, right? So here we have a military that frankly doesn't care about launching a man to the moon, right? But still, they're kind of forced to do that. So I've talked a bit about the civilian agencies, right, that were under the command of the Soviet military, right, and that answered to them and got funding from them also. So one of the key agencies there was OKB-1. OKB stands for Experimental Design Bureau, and it was these bureaus that were like responsible for designing and producing rockets, right?
Yeah, and these bureaus sort of were the Soviet equivalent of different companies in a Western style system.
Exactly. They were called enterprises, actually. The official name for that was enterprise under the Soviet economy. And really, when it came to, although the economy was planned, when it came to like procurement of rockets and equipment, it functioned almost like a free market.
Yes, they introduced the competitive aspect.
Yeah, exactly. And so here we have OKB-1, right? Headed by Sergei Korolev. Sergei Korolev, he was the mastermind of the Soviet space effort, right?
Yeah.
He was like the Soviet Werner von Braun. He
slightly less German.
Yeah, slightly less German and more Soviet, right? But still, like in terms of his achievements, he was like Werner von Braun. For example, he was the man who managed to put Sputnik into orbit, right, and Gagarin into orbit as well.
Right, the pinnacles of the Soviet space program.
Exactly, they were all headed under him. So he was like your go-to guy if you wanted to actualize any mission in the Soviet space program, right? He's your go-to.
Yes.
Yeah, and this entire structure, right, with bureaus and the Central Committee and the military, right? It was very bureaucratic.
Obviously.
And yeah, it was very bureaucratic, like in Soviet style, right? So and Korolev realized this, and part of the reason why he managed to do all these achievements, right? It was because he was a really good administrator, right?
Yeah.
He had a talent for managing various different people and bureaus, right? And
he knew which forms to sign.
Exactly. He knew the paperwork, right? And he knew how to make things efficient. So what he did is he created the Council of Chief Designers, right? Now, this council, it was an informal council, right? It wasn't an official body. It was just an informal, like, council of all of the heads of these experimental design bureaus, right?
Which would be competing to get their designs to the top.
Yeah, they would be competing, but they also would be, some of them would be cooperating, right? Because one design bureau would create the rocket, the other one would create the engines.
Yeah, then it's pretty important that the engines fit the rocket.
Exactly. So there was a lot of competition there, don't get me wrong, but there was also the need for cooperation between the bureaus, right? So he created the Council of Chief Designers, and this allowed the bureaus to bypass a lot of the bureaucracy in the Soviet space program, right? However, this also made the space program very reliant on Korolev, right?
Yeah, so if something terrible were to happen to him, they would have a problem.
Yes, and something terrible did happen to him.
Alright, now I'm interested.
Yeah, we'll get to that later, right?
Okay.
Yeah. But really this competition between the bureaus, right? It allowed for a lot of rivalries, right?
Right.
And I think that the rivalries and disagreements in this in the Soviet moon effort is one of the most endearing, like it's one of the cutest aspects of it, right? Because you have this like huge like bureaucratic machine and like huge efficient industry, right? And like the entire program just flops because some of the designers didn't agree on something. And one of the most interesting ones is the one between Korolev, right, this mastermind, and Valentin Glushko. Glushko was responsible for creating the engines of the rocket.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see where the problem might come because there's room for disagreement between them, I presume.
Exactly. Now we have to get a bit technical here, right?
Okay.
So there are two main ways of creating a rocket engine, right? Or two propellants, rather. You have hypergolic, or no, let's start with the conventional ones, right? You have the conventional propellant, right, where you have an oxidizer and a fuel. The reason you take with you an oxidizer is because there isn't any oxygen in space, right? And for a combustion to occur, you need oxygen, so or an oxidizing agent. Yeah, it's basic chemistry. So you have a mix of a fuel and an oxidizer, and you have to manually ignite it, or not manually, but you have to have an ignition spark or ignition source, right? That's the conventional way of doing things.
Just a car engine with the extra step of the oxidizer coming not from the air but from a tank.
Basically, it's the same reaction, right?
Yeah.
But then you also have hypergolic propellants, and what this means is that you have a fuel and an oxidizer. However, they combust spontaneously. They combust upon contact with each other.
Sounds dangerous.
That's what Korolev thought. Korolev was a very big proponent of conventional propellants, where you have to ignite it with an ignition source. However, Glushko he really liked the idea of hypergolic propellants. Now there were many advantages with hypergolic propellants, right? He didn't advocate them without a reason.
No.
Yeah. So one of the advantages is that you can make more reliable rocket engines, right? You don't have to have as many components.
You have less points of error.
Right, exactly. This is where it all boils down to how can we make something more reliable, right?
Right, simpler the better.
Yeah, so you don't need an ignition mechanism here, for example. And also, with conventional fuels, the oxidizers, at that time at least, the oxidizer was often liquid oxygen. Now, as you can imagine, liquid oxygen has to be stored at incredibly cold temperatures.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and that raised the question of whether that would affect structural integrity of the rocket, right? And also, you had to have a way of actually cooling the thing, right?
That's another layer of complexity.
Exactly. So, Glushko, he was very keen on the efficiency and reliability part of this, right? However, there are also some very clear disadvantages with hypergolic propellants. One of them being is that they spontaneously combust. And and Korolev really didn't like the idea of putting a man on a rocket with propellants that spontaneously combust, because, as you can imagine, the rocket can explode.
Yeah, that wouldn't be very nice for the person in the rocket.
No, and certainly wouldn't be nice for the reputation of the Soviet space program. You know, people are replaceable, but reputation, nah.
Yeah.
You can't fix that, easily.
And maybe this is connected to their roles, because someone who designs an engine will try to make the best possible engine, but they will do it without consideration for what the engine is being used for necessarily.
Exactly. And you have to remember, this was also in this was also in relation to the military aspect of it, right?
Right.
Because they want to make ICBMs, of course.
And in the ICBMs, it's not that important if they spontaneously explode a bit.
Yeah, it's it's still bad.
It's just the timing.
yeah, it's just the timing, exactly. As long as the warhead isn't armed, then everything should be good. But also, again, out of concern for the cosmonauts, Korolev also didn't like hypergolic propellants because they were incredibly toxic. Conventional propellants, they usually at that time were liquid oxygen, and what was it again? It was RP1. Is what they called it. It was basically just really refined kerosene.
Better the devil you know. Better the devil you know.
Exactly. And liquid oxygen, sure, it's really cold and can give you a frostbite, but you don't get cancer from it.
No.
And you don't get cancer from RP1 either, from kerosene. I mean, come on, it's kerosene, basically. Hypergolic propellants, on the other hand, they were extremely carcinogenic, they were extremely toxic, it was extremely difficult to handle them, and if some of that propellant leaked into the cabin, you would have a really, really bad time.
And I presume it's not only the cosmonauts, but also all the engineers and technical workers working with the rocket who have the risk of being exposed to it.
Exactly, and there's... he did this out of concern for the cosmonauts, basically, and all the personnel working on it.
I mean, there's no point sending a man to the moon if there's no living man on board the rocket when you get to the moon.
Exactly. If the man dies on the way there, then, you've wasted a bunch of rubles for nothing, basically.
Right.
So, I can see why Korolev was opposed to hypergolic propellants. However, I can also see why Glushko was really for hypergolic propellants. Because, again, they started this late, and really Glushko's reasoning was also that it was only with hypergolic engines that we would actually get to beat the Americans.
Yes, because you have the competitive aspect of it as well, which is, we have to win at any cost.
Exactly. So I can see where Glushko was coming from. However, Korolev, he was the head. Not only was he responsible for the rocket, but he was also the head of the entire lunar mission.
So
right?
he would make the final decision to use the conventional fuels.
Exactly, and there was this really funny episode, right? Or not funny, but absurd episode, right? Where It was Korolev's deputy writes this in his memoirs that there was this another designer, right, who saw this feud between Korolev and Glushko, right, and he wanted to kind of like cheer them up a bit, and he wanted them to agree on something, so he invited them to a meeting, right, and what happened is that or before I say this, right, in order to because since Korolev wanted a conventional alternative, right?
Yes.
So he then went to another design bureau, right? He went to Nikolai Kuznetsov design bureau, and this bureau, they weren't experienced with rocket engines at all. They designed turboprops.
Oh.
Yeah, they designed plane engines. And you can see why Glushko was a bit, upset about this.
Just because of his concern over the fuel, he's choosing a frankly inferior design bureau.
Exactly, and Glushko was kind of concerned with this. Not concerned, but he was upset with this, right? Because here he is, he's trying his best to create a rocket engine, right? And then this dude Korolev, right? He just goes around him to a turboprop designer. And you can see why he was upset about this. And what happened is that at the meeting, Glushko literally said that Korolev was playing footsie with the aviation industry. And and I just have this image of these like two men in like these 60s just like throwing playground insults at each other, just like, yeah, you're playing footsie with the aviation industry, and yeah, you have no concern for the cosmonauts.
I mean, this is their life's work, right? This is what they care about, so you can understand that they get passionate.
Exactly. But as you can imagine, the meeting ended quite badly, and then Korolev's deputy, he writes in his memoirs again that he does not remember them talking ever again. So that kind of says something. But either way, I mentioned Kuznetsov Design Bureau, and yeah, as I said, it was an aviation design bureau, right? And they designed engines and turboprops and plane engines, basically.
Yes.
Right? But thing is, if you've designed a jet engine, it's not really that hard to design a rocket engine. And what Kuznetsov Design Bureau came up with is what's still regarded as one of the most efficient rocket engines ever made. So efficient, by efficient I mean how much fuel they use and how much thrust like the ratio between thrust generated and fuel used, right? Not raw power.
Higher the better.
Yeah, exactly. But these were relatively small rocket engines, right? Which is why they needed 30 of them to power the moon rocket.
Now that you think about it, that actually makes sense, because in aviation, the efficiency of the engine is extremely important, because weight is... I mean, it's not as at a premium as in space flight, but it's still a pretty huge consideration, and you want to be able to fly for long distances.
Yeah, exactly, and you also have to think about fuel costs, right? The biggest expense to any aviation industry is... Right, so Alex's computer ran out of disk space, so we kind of got cut off there. However, thanks to the Audacity gods, the file we were... recording it got restored, so nothing was lost there.
We officially endorse Audacity as great audio recording program. Good job.
Whoever
made it.
Thank you. Saved us 30 minutes. So either way, we were talking about the aviation industry, right? And we were also talking about God damn it! Wait.
You're talking about the rivalry, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and
they designed the very efficient rocket engine, but it wasn't very powerful.
Yeah, exactly. And what I was trying to say is that because think about it, you have 30 rocket engines, right? Only in the first stage. The first stage has 30 rocket engines. Now that's 30 variables, right? That can go wrong.
That's so much room for error.
Yeah, there's extremely much room for error, and the Soviet engineers, they realized this, right? And so what they did is they came up with this. They tried to come up with this system, right? They called it CHORD. It was basically like this clever little system that would detect like engine failure, and it would shut off the opposite engine of that failing engine, right, to maintain symmetrical thrust, right?
That's smart.
But it didn't really work out either, and also they calculated that that in total only 2 engines could fail.
So out of what, 30?
Yeah, out of 30. So again, it's not really optimal, right?
I mean, what's the average failure rate on a rocket engine?
I don't know, but needless to say, 30 rocket engines, it's an absurd amount.
Should have used more struts.
Should have used more struts. Yes. Unfortunately, auto strut isn't a thing in
In real
reality.
life.
Yeah.
Sad.
Yeah, it's really sad. So what this led to is that out of the 4 times the rocket was tested, it exploded 4 times. And yeah,
That's a pretty high failure rate.
and separate. Yeah, I think 100% failure rate isn't something you want for your space program. So
Even for something that's experimental and risky, that's still a bit high.
yeah, exactly. And 3 out of 4 times it exploded because one of the engines failed, and that was that.
So at this point, maybe they thought maybe these hypergolic fuels ain't that bad after all.
Yeah, exactly. But you have to remember, this was like well underway. This was like in 1966 or 67 when they tested it.
Yeah.
So they didn't really have that much time on them.
Future was looking grim.
Yeah, exactly. Also grimmer was the fate of Korolev, who, I mentioned earlier that something terrible happened to him, right?
Yes.
He died. In 1966, he died. He actually died of injuries, or it's pure speculation, right? But some of the a theory is that he died in surgery, right?
Mm.
And one of the theories is that he had to go into surgery because of injuries he sustained in the gulags. Yeah, because he was gulagged, right?
Was he gulagged after or before the space program?
Before he was gulagged in the Great Purge, so in 1936, 1937. And, actually, I forgot to mention this. This was also one of the reasons why Korolev and Glushko didn't really like each other, because Glushko snitched on Korolev, right? So,
So they had history.
yeah, so they had a little bit of history, and Korolev wasn't exactly happy with him going to the gulag because of Glushko. So
It's all starting to add up.
yeah, so not only did you have this professional disagreement, you also had this, I'd say, extremely personal one.
So you're saying that the entire Soviet space program was undermined by a personal rivalry between 2 men?
Basically, or maybe not the entire space program, but the manned lunar mission part of it. Yes, certainly. You can make the case there. But after his death in 1966, you lose this very influential figure and this essential figure also.
Right, who was able to go through the bureaucracy and get things done.
Yeah, exactly. He was replaced by a man called Grishin, and Grishin, although he was a very competent engineer, he was a very incompetent manager.
Yeah.
This basically made the Soviet space program, or the manned lunar mission at least, slow down to a snail's pace, and they didn't really get much done.
And this is a very typical problem in any business of any kind, is that
Right.
You have someone, an engineer or a practical worker put in a leadership position, and maybe they're really good at what they do, but they just don't know how to lead and manage bureaucracy.
Exactly. And the thing with Korolev is he was both an excellent engineer and an excellent manager. However, here you have an excellent engineer, however, a very mediocre manager.
So at this point, the manned lunar mission is basically dead because it's 1 or 2 years until the first successful United States landing on the moon.
Yeah, like the Korolev died in 66, and Grishin took his position in 67, so that was like 2 years until until Apollo 11.
And I presume after this sort of final American victory, there wasn't really that much interest in pursuing further space exploration by the Soviets.
Exactly. Or at least manned lunar exploration. But because, let's think about it, you don't really get any scientific value out of putting a man on the moon, aside from the moon rocks.
There's no silver medal in the space race.
Exactly. And really, like, what's important is going to other planets, right? Examining the surface of Venus, for example, or examining the surface of Mars. The Soviets already did put a manned lunar. They already put a rover on the moon to examine its geology and its like rock composition or whatever, right? So they already got the scientific part of the way out, and so really the manned lunar missions, as a whole, they were just propaganda pieces, right? And like in practice, and so really there wasn't any interest in pursuing the manned lunar mission after the Americans put a man on the moon.
So we talked about how this personal rivalry was a very big problem, and in attempting a successful manned lunar mission, how would you say economic factors played a role?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say that. Don't get me wrong. The Soviets, they were very happy to spend to spend money on their military and by extension on the space program, right? However, due to how it was organized, a lot of the economic funds or economic assets,
Yes.
right? They weren't really put to good use because. As I mentioned earlier, you had a lot of these bureaus, right, who not only were competing with each other, they would also work on parallel projects, right?
Yes.
So, for example, you had Korolev's bureau, who built this monstrosity of a rocket, right, the N1. And you also had, who was it? Chelomey's bureau. That's another designer, right, a very influential designer who also built rockets. And he also built a moon rocket. And he built the UR-500, I think. That's a whole nother topic, by the way. But I just want to highlight the misallocation of resources here.
There's some inefficiencies here, and it's sort of perhaps a wider symptoms of many problems of a planned economy.
Exactly. Right. You don't really have the. First of all, a planned economy doesn't really give much room for economic innovation, right?
The thing is, it's only as good as the planners who's planning it.
Yeah, basically. And although there are many cases for a planned economy, there are also many cases against it. But that's a whole nother topic.
Obviously.
Yeah. So again, you have this inefficiency, or you have this misallocation of resources, and you also have the misallocation of manpower. And of course, again, this all intertwines into the military side of it, right? Because think about it, what does the military want? They want tanks, they want rockets, they want...
spy satellites and ICBMs?
Exactly. Nothing that relates to manned lunar exploration.
No.
Yeah. So you also had like the military holding the funds in a chokehold, basically, and them being very reluctant to allocate funds to them. But also this can also come from the fact that Brezhnev was in power at the time, right? Because unlike Khrushchev was what I would say a very radical communist, right? Or a very ideological one, at least. Of course, Brezhnev was also a communist, but he was more like rational, or not rational, but more, I'd say, pragmatic.
Yes.
Right. Khrushchev, on the other hand, he believed in like big, extravagant projects, right? I'd say it's one of the main reasons why a lot of space exploration happened under Khrushchev, right? For example, Sputnik 1, Gagarin, Laika, right? It's because he was a very big fan of showing the world the progress of the Soviet economy and scientific...
it was very good for prestige.
Exactly. Khrushchev cared a lot for prestige. However, Brezhnev, he was very pragmatic, and he wasn't really that big of a fan of such big projects. He thought very pragmatically on how to compete with the West, and he didn't really see the point in spending billions of rubles on just putting a man on the moon.
And this is probably... how much do you think public sentiment played a role? Because we classically think that in the West there was public sentiment for these space exploration missions, and this is why the funding was allocated and they were successful. How important do you think it was in the Soviet Union?
Well, I mean, at least we can argue that the United States is sort of a democracy, right?
Right?
Yeah.
At least they claim to be.
Yeah. At least they claim to be, and in some respects they are a democracy, right?
Well, that's another discussion.
Yeah, but that's a whole nother discussion. I don't think it really fits into our podcast here, but either way, but I'd say that even if the people were unhappy with the Soviet government's decision, the government would still do that, right? Because they frankly didn't really care that much. We saw the government, for example, pouring massive amounts of money or funds into the military, right? I think it was by 1991, 45% of the annual GDP was spent on the military, which it's an absurd amount.
That is pretty crazy.
Yeah, 45% should not be a fraction in any country's GDP, like whatsoever.
No.
So whatever it is, it's absurd to even just think about it. And but they did it like they didn't really think of like the opinion of the masses. I'd say that the population was very they weren't against space exploration, right?
No,
Because you have to think of the time, right? It was a very optimistic time, like both in the United States and in the Soviet Union, right?
everyone was excited about the future.
Exactly. So I don't think public opinion really that had that much to say. But even if public opinion was, against it, it still wouldn't really affect it that much.
Because I feel like it's commonly accepted in the West that the losing of the space race sort of showed the fail, like that communism was dying in the Soviet Union to the people.
Yeah.
How much do you think this is propaganda, and how much do you think it reflects reality?
I don't think that the United States putting a man on the moon really can have that big of an effect on the stability of the Soviet Union,
No.
right? Because I mean that was like one failure, right? The Soviets they okay now my biases are really showing, right? But I don't care, okay? The Soviets they achieved much more, or at least from what I've been taught, right, or from what I've read, right, the Soviets they managed to achieve a lot more than what the Americans did. Sure, that's not to say the Americans didn't have any great achievements during the space race. That's not what I'm saying, right? GPS, for example, right? I'd say it's one of the most important achievements in modern history, right?
Yes, very much.
Yeah, but you have to remember the Soviets because it's absurd to put a finish line to the space race, right? Because there's literally no limit.
I mean, there kind of wasn't a reason that they couldn't, I don't know, continue on to Mars.
Exactly. So I'd say that the space race is won by the ones who started it.
Yeah.
Right.
So you say that the sort of Soviet loss was overplayed, and the Soviet victories within the space race are often downplayed in sort of Western media and such.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't blame Western media for doing this.
No,
Not at all.
because in a way, its history is written by the victors.
Yeah, in a way, and of course, Westerners are going to hear more about Neil Armstrong, who was himself a Westerner, right? You also have the Iron Curtain here to consider, right? Because not a lot of Westerners of course, Westerners heard about Gagarin.
There was
right?
information quarantine in a way.
Basically. So not a lot of information was going out of the Soviet Union, right? In a way, we don't really know the names of Chinese astronauts, right?
No.
But but the Chinese probably know their names.
Yeah.
Exactly. So really, I don't blame anyone at all for this, but it just but I'd say that if the situation is like this here, like where we don't really know the names of Russian or Chinese astronauts, right? It was probably the same in the USSR, right? I actually asked my father, who lived in the Soviet Union, and he said that. I mean, he knew who Neil Armstrong was, right? Because he was a nerd. But none of his peers knew, right? For example, yeah. Or my mom, for example, she didn't know the name Neil Armstrong until like 2015 or something.
Yeah,
So
that is pretty interesting to consider because it's hard to imagine coming from a Western country not knowing the name Neil Armstrong. I mean, the whole one step for man, a big leap for mankind.
yeah, exactly, and you also have to consider the Iron Curtain around the censorship of information that happened in the USSR. So yeah, it's but coming back to your question, I don't think that it had much of an effect really.
No.
I'd say that there were other things to consider when it comes to the failure of communism.
Probably.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is, if they could have probably put a man on the moon if they diverted the funding, but they'd probably better off not doing it.
Exactly. I mean, of course they could have.
Yes.
And if they want to, they would have. But again, they saw very little reason to do this.
They shouldn't have.
Yeah. Again, they saw very little reason to do that after the Americans managed to put theirs on the moon. So yeah, so that's why the Soviets didn't make it to the moon. In short, it was because the military didn't want to. It because the designers, although they wanted to, they didn't really agree with each other because of differing design philosophies and because someone snitched on someone, and someone spent 7 years in the gulag. No big deal.
No big deal.
No big deal. died in surgery because of injuries sustained there. No biggie. Yeah, and also in big part due to the overly bureaucratic nature of the Soviet economy.
Right.
So yeah.
We hope we've been able to provide you with an interesting perspective, or at least we sound like two rambling idiots and can entertain in some way.
Yeah.
And
yeah, we're still not exactly comfortable with speaking in front of a microphone, so we hope this wasn't too painful to listen to.
No, and have a good day.
Yeah, in these trying times.